Hi, my name is Caroline Fry, and this is my Minority Psychologist presentation. For my presentation, I covered Carolyn Robertson Payton, and I'll be going over a timeline of her life, what the major events in history were, and the major events in psychology, her major contributions to psychology, as well as my own impression of her work. So, Payton was born in 1925 in Norfolk, Virginia. Her mother was a seamstress and her father was a ship steward. One of the most important values in her home growing up was education. Her grandfather was born a slave, but education was very important to him, and he was able to make sure that all of his children, as well as his grandchildren, attended college. Some of the most important values to her that she developed as a child and carried over into her adulthood were courage, loyalty, and equality. As a child, she attended public school in her hometown of Norfolk, Virginia, and after graduating from high school, she received a home economics degree from Bennett College. Bennett College was a historically black women's college, but Payton later described it as hoping to shape her womanhood, as well as further develop her beliefs, aspirations, and attitudes. Bennett was a very special place to Payton, and she regarded it fondly all throughout her life. And later in life, in the 90s, she was actually able to establish a scholarship fund in her name at Bennett College. After she graduated from Bennett College, she went on to pursue a master's in psychology from the University of Wisconsin. Her initial journey at the University of Wisconsin was first impacted by the separate but equal doctrine, which is something I will go into more detail later on. It was during her time at the University of Wisconsin that she developed her thesis. A common belief at the time, due to the heavy racism of this time period, was that white people had an intellectual advantage over black people, and Payton was determined to disprove this belief, and that's what she focused her thesis on. After she graduated from the University of Wisconsin, she first worked at Elizabeth City Teachers College as a psychologist, and then went on to Howard State University, where she became a professor in 1959. It was also during this time that she began to pursue her doctoral degree in student administration and counseling, and eventually she was able to complete her doctoral degree in 1962. Beginning in 1970, Payton served as director of Howard University Counseling Services, and then after this time, she became the Dean of Counseling and Career Services. During her time at Howard University, especially while serving as director and dean, it was during this time that many women, especially black women, began to view Payton as a role model for professionalism in the workplace, as well as a feminist role model overall. Another interesting thing about Payton was that in 1977, she was appointed as director of the Peace Corps by President Jimmy Carter, and she served as director of the Peace Corps for about 2 years, from 1977 to 1978. So as I mentioned before, she was the Dean of Counseling and Career Services from 1979, and she actually served in this position up until 1995 when she retired. After her retirement, she received the American Psychological Association Award for Outstanding Lifetime Contribution to Psychology in 1997. And after this major achievement, just a few short years later, in 2001, she tragically passed away from a heart attack at age 75. Prior to Payton's birth, the 13th Amendment had been passed, which abolished slavery. However, prejudice and racism and inequality still had a long way to go. Gender equality had also accomplished a major success with the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment allowed white and black women the right to vote, Although this was a major accomplishment for women of both races, it really allowed Black women to have more confidence in the ability to run for office and speak up about freedoms, and eventually gave way to the civil rights movement. So during Peyton's time, the civil rights movement was definitely at its peak during the 50s and 60s. Peyton's college experience at the University of Wisconsin, where she achieved her graduate degree, was actually impacted by the separate but equal doctrine, mostly the hypocrisy of the separate but equal doctrine. Since she was pursuing a degree in a discipline available to whites at White State School, her tuition was paid for by the state of Virginia. But the state of Virginia did not cover expenses for disciplines available to Black students who attended Black state schools. So if Peyton had chosen to attend a Black state school, her tuition would not have been covered by the state. Also during this time, you have Black feminists and civil rights activists such as Rosa Parks, who further challenged racial and gender inequality and sort of paved the way for more voices for the equality movement. You also have women such as Betty Friedan, who was heavily focused on eliminating gender discrimination and helped give women a voice. After Peyton died in 2001, the fight for inequality still continued to persist. African Americans continued to break down racial barriers. You have the first Black president, Barack Obama, and you also have trailblazers, much like Carolyn Robertson Peyton, with people like Condoleezza Rice, who was the first Black female Secretary of State. And despite these major accomplishments for Black people, the fight for equality still exists today. Now moving on to some of the major events in psychology that pertain to Peyton. One of the major events of psychology before Peyton was born was the establishment of the first experimental psychology lab in 1879 by Wilhelm Wundt. This was important because later on, Peyton would go to teach experimental psychology at Howard University and conduct her own research. Another important event prior to Peyton's time was William James writing The Principles of Psychology. One of the aspects of his work focused on human intelligence and human nature from a functionalist perspective, and this was important because it would later influence Peyton's thesis at the University of Wisconsin, which was something she wrote to disprove the common belief that whites and blacks had different intelligence levels. Another important figure in psychology prior to Peyton's time was Mary Whitney Calkins. Calkins had been making strides as a woman in psychology. She had overcome a lot of obstacles from gender discrimination. In 1906, Calkins became the first woman president of the American Psychological Association, which is something that Carolyn Robertson Peyton would become heavily involved in later in life. Mary Whitney Calkins paved the way for women like Peyton to have an equal place in intellectual fields like psychology. Psychology during Peyton's life. So you have Carl Rogers, who focused on client-centered therapy in 1942. Later on, Peyton would go to work in client-centered therapy as well, specializing with African American patients. Also, you have Bandura's studies with child psychology. Child psychology was breaking new ground, and Bandura's studies in observational learning in 1961. His studies with the Bobo doll helped us learn that children behave from what they observe and imitate. His time in child psychology was important for Peyton because later on, she would become a professor in child psychology and also conduct her own research in this area. Another interesting accomplishment in the world of psychology that happened during Peyton's time was the publication of the first DSM, and Peyton actually lived to see 4 editions of the DSM published before her death in 2001. After her death, there was a lot of new ground broken in terms of genetics and genetic engineering, and the focus in psychology sort of shifted to include genetics into the research. Also, in 2013, the DSM-5 was published. Carolyn Robertson Payton has a very long list of contributions that she made and many major accomplishments throughout her life. During her time as a dean at Howard University, she pioneered group therapy for Black Americans, and she also worked as a professor, teaching classes on child, abnormal, and experimental psychology. Her time as a professor and the way that she pioneered group therapy for Black Americans really allowed many of them to get the help that they needed and had been denied for so long, and also just paved the way for Black Americans in psychology. She knew that minorities were often overlooked, and so that's why her focus was heavily on them so that they were able to get the help that they needed. She also spent many years on the American Psychological Association. She served on multiple boards and committees, and one of these committees was the Women in Psychology Committee. And she even served on a task force specializing on psychology for Black women. Her time in the APA was very, very much influential. She was able to eliminate sex biases in psychotherapeutic practice. She made a huge difference in the lives of many, just with her commitment to fighting racial inequality and gender discrimination, and she really made a lasting impact on many lives. Without Peyton's work, there would have been a lot of equality still needing to be fought today. She was a major trailblazer. I found it very interesting that she was the very first woman, as well as the first African American, to be director of the Peace Corps. So in that respect, as well as both counseling and psychology, she was just a huge role model for Black women and Black people overall. Definitely with the amount of awards that she received from the American Psychological Association, you can see her lasting impact and how she just inspired so many people. And she's definitely an inspiration to women and minorities everywhere. And these are my references.